So now I get the pleasure of introducing the next speaker because the person we owe so much to for this meeting and for last year's meeting, Rita Caldwell, when she accepted the presidency, I was overwhelmed with gratitude, and I am thrilled to be working with you on this, Rita, and everything that you have brought to the society. I cannot thank you enough. So therefore, I get to introduce the next speaker because Rita is a little bit shy about doing that. Because Sharon Bertsch of McGrayne is developing a biography about Rita. And she's going to tell us what it's like to do writing about a living legend. Now, she has already written books. Her latest book tells how an 18th century approach to assessing evidence was ignored for much of the 20th century before an overnight sea change. She's also a former prize-winning journalist, and she is the perfect person, I think, to do this particular work. As difficult as it may be, I cannot imagine, but I think it's more important, really, to have a biography written about a living legend, because you can get their participation, your references will be current, and I know you are going to do a superb job with this rich material that you have here.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and for that very nice introduction. And I have to thank Gary over there for helping me with the technological rescue to avert catastrophe. I'm having a wonderful time with these 2 days of meetings, and it struck me that one of the undercurrent themes of the meeting is how to democratize science, was the phrase we used earlier this morning, how to communicate with the public, how to spread the word. So I'm writing the book with Rita about her experiences in science and the problems that women face today in science and indeed more broadly in the STEM subjects. And so I thought I would talk to you about the challenge of writing books, which is what I do primarily now, that have some solid science in it, but still can engage the popular, the general reader. Many of you all here will be asked to write about your experiences, not just for your specialist colleagues, but for the general public. So some of the problems that I face, you'll be on the other side of the desk, so to speak, facing them from the other direction. There's an obvious tension of writing something that contains some solid science that the specialists in the field will read with pleasure, and something that at the very same time is something that will make the general reader read it from cover to cover. And I have to say part of that tension originates because occasionally I think a scientist's favorite literary style is the abstract for Nature magazine. And we got to get beyond that, okay? So I thought I would today talk about how this tension plays out using two contrasting examples that I've had to deal with. My first book, called Nobel Prize Women in Science, Their Lives, Struggles, and Momentous Discoveries, is published by the National Academy of Sciences. It's been in print for more than 20 years. And my last book was for Yale University Press, and it was a history of Bayesian probability, and it has an incredibly long title, The Theory That Wouldn't Die, How Bayes' Rule Cracked the Enigma Code, Hunted Down Russian Submarines, and emerged triumphant from 2 centuries of controversy. Yeah, I have to write that one out. I don't always get the words right. I always begin with some truth in advertising. I am not a scientist, I'm not a mathematician, I'm not a statistician. I come out of newspapers. But when the newspaper industry made the conscious decision to compete with television by dumbing down, I had to get out. I realized it was depressing me, it was depressing my whole family. So I had to get out. And this was back in the days before Wikipedia, when Encyclopedia Britannica was kind of the main source for information about science and other topics. And I went to work for Encyclopedia Britannica for a year, rewriting all the physics articles. They had been written at the level of a senior postdoc in physics, and I took them down, as they requested, down to the level of a college sophomore level. And in the process, I was very proud to become a co-author of 2 very long, full-length articles about physics. And that gave me some legitimacy in saying I was a science writer. Okay? So that was the transition I needed. Now, one of the many reasons why it's so nice to be here at the Rosalind Franklin Society is that when I wrote Nobel Prize Women in Science, the heroine of one of the chapters is Rosalind Franklin. And I started writing the book in about 1990, during a deep, deep recession caused by the small Japanese cars. And the mantra then by all the experts and the media was that the United States is washed up. We can never compete with Japan because we don't have enough scientists and engineers. So I, in my simple-mindedness, thought, well, if we could get the women in the science families where the boys become scientists and engineers, if we could get their sisters to go into science and engineering, we would immediately double the number of American scientists and engineers, okay? And I knew from being a news reporter at the time, I knew from my feet on the ground observations that young women were not taking even calculus in high school and beginning college. I'm interested in people, so I thought I could examine the topic by looking at some women scientists to see what they had experienced. There was very little written about the subject of women in science at the time. Margaret Rossiter had come out with her magnificent book, Women Scientists in America Before 1972, and I recommend it to everyone. But because of the paucity of writing about the subject, I didn't know what I would find. I asked around in the very beginning, and people told me that the public doesn't know that there are any women in science. If they do know someone, it's only Marie Curie. They think she's boring and dull. And the assumption was, in 1990, that women don't do world-class research. So I thought I could use the Nobel Prize for my own nefarious ends. That if I picked women who had been either won a Nobel Prize in science, or to make the group a little bit bigger and more impressive, I would put in some women who had contributed in a very important way to a prize that a man had won. Now, I was fortunate in I was writing the book so early that 8 of the 15 women were still alive, and I could interview all 8 of them in person. This is C.S. Wu, physicist from Columbia. Gertrude Elion in the drug industry, AZT. Gertrude Elion. Okay, we heard about ACT earlier today. This is Jocelyn Bell Burnell, who was in Edinburgh at the time I visited her. Rosalind Franklin, of course. Well, the others I don't have on here. But I also went to see Dorothy Hodgkin in England, and Rita Levi-Montalcini in Rome, and of course Barbara McClintock in Cold Spring Harbor. I was also early enough so that even for the most early women, the pioneers, Marie Curie, Lisa Meitner, and Emmy Noether, I was able to find people who had actually known them, students and postdocs, family members, and so on. With Marie Curie, for example, her daughter Eve, who had written the biography that many of us have read years ago, was still alive and was talking with writers regularly. 2 of Marie Curie's grandchildren who had known her when they were adults became very eminent scientists, one a biologist and one the other a physicist in France. And the granddaughter, the physicist, had actually read and studied her grandmother's notebooks, her laboratory records. And so she could tell me about that. Even Emmy Nutter in mathematics, I could still reach family members and students and postdocs. Doing this book, I realized that I crave primary sources. You just can't beat talking to the scientist who made the discovery, who did the work. And when you talk to them directly, you learn what their problem was. What was the problem to be solved? Why was it going to be solved in this particular way? Where did they see the problem in that particular way? How they did the experiment, problems they had, the things they were proud of and displeased with, how they thought it was going to play out in the future. You don't get that fresh, exciting experience when you're reading about it from a secondary source written by somebody like me. So I wound up going to archives all over the US, but also in France and Germany. And I realized when I wrote the little thing that appears on the back of the book for the publisher, I counted up the number of interviews I'd done, and I talked to more than 300 people. But I have to tell you that writing Nobel Prize women in science was a high, because not only were those women fabulous, but so were their friends. There was nothing to be gained by being the friend of one of these women scientific aristocrats at the time. So they were bound to be nice people too, and totally all of them were excited and in love with doing science. So for example, Rosalind Franklin, I visited James Watson at Cold Spring Harbor, I talked to Crick, but the person who was the biggest help to me besides Anne and Donald Sayers and her students and her postdocs was Aaron Klug in Cambridge, England. Now Klug had, by the time I talked to him, had won his own Nobel Prize, but he had been her colleague and he'd studied her notebooks, he kept them in the cupboard in the hallway, and he spent hours and hours of time talking with writers like myself about Rosalind. There was another one in a similar situation, Arthur Kornberg, who won a Nobel Prize himself, and whose son, in fact, has recently won one. Rita Levi-Montalcini had talked about in her autobiography about how she was close friends with Arthur Kornberg. So I emailed or mailed him a letter asking for an interview. I immediately got a phone call back. I have to tell you that in my business, you ask for the interview and you do not expect you people to call back. I have to dun you all a little bit before you respond, okay? Arthur Kornberg called back immediately. He said, I'm going to tell you precisely the number of times I have spoken with Rita Levi-Montalcini, and he practically told me the number of words they had exchanged. 3 times and the number of words. And he said, the person I really want to talk to you about is Gertie Curie. And he had been in her laboratory. She trained many other Nobel Prize winners. And he said, I'm sending you a package. I've already put it together. It's going out in the mail today. And he proceeded to give me this magnificent interview and to tell me other people and how to connect with them. The man was fabulous. So Barbara McClintock was the exception. Let's see if she was on here. Sure. Oh, there's Dorothy Hodgkin, and I saw in England with her terribly rheumatoid hands. That was Rita Levi-Montalcini. And here, of course, is Barbara McClintock. And that's how she looked when I met her at Cold Spring Harbor. But she had, I was told by some of her very closest personal friends that she had disapproved of a writer who, once she learned that interviews with her were going to culminate in a book, cut off the interviews and refused to answer any more questions. So I treaded very carefully and worked through Evelyn Whitkin, whom you may know, she was at Rutgers, and finally got to Barbara McClintock, so she would talk to me on the telephone, and eventually asked me to Cold Spring Harbor. And her friends indeed told me that she wound up enjoying our interviews and looked forward to them. It's a rather long and involved story about how this happened, and there's not time for it. But the point is that even Barbara McClintock realized it was time to talk about problems that women in science had had. Now, by the end of writing that book, I realized that I had, well, my disadvantage that I wasn't a scientist was obvious, but I did have some advantages. One is that I can see through the eyes of the reader. I can see what and imagine what the reader is going to respond to and answering it. Then I like scientific topics that explain or have to do with broad social problems. And I like to do it early enough so the public is still interested in the problem. Timing is very important in these things. Another advantage is that I run scared. I over-research everything. I wind up with dozens of pages of bibliography and notes. Okay, one of my publishers objected to that, and I had to tell him, well, you don't get the book unless you publish them all, and they agreed. And the other thing is that I really look forward to sending out sections or chapters or portions of the book to other people to ask their reactions to it, to get their comments or corrections or insights and so on. So the result was that with Nobel Prize Women in Science, when it came out, it had become an issue that engaged both the public and the scientists very much. Why weren't there more women in science? And the reaction to the book was remarkable because it was really the beginning of the decline of the nonfiction book in publishing. I gave symposia all over the United States, in Europe. Almost every month for several years, I was going off and giving these talks. I was on an hour-long panel on NPR's Talk of the Nation. The book was on Charlie Rose's show. And I'm proud that it convinced the feminists that women scientists were not anti-feminism, but that they were indeed part and parcel of the same problem. Now, my last book for Yale University Press was very different, because by that time publishers wanted books about mathematics. Longitude and Beautiful Mind had sold very well. Very few people were willing to try to write about mathematics. This one was quite difficult for me. I was profiling not a person, but an 18th century mathematical statement. And the topic was still so controversial. Bayes' rule in statistics was wildly controversial for 200 years, and it wasn't until the very last few years when the computer industry took it up that it really settled down. And there were very few histories of the Bayes' rule, except for portions of the 18th, 19th, very early 20th century. So I wound up having to read archives, especially in France, and then interview people who had written their work originally. I found they did not understand, despite my pleading, that they must read over and correct and talk to me about what I'd done wrong, about when I'd written up their work. I found that I couldn't find anyone who would help me with the broad framework, with the broad outline of the book. So I had to struggle with that on myself. And for several years, it wasn't a fun book. It was interesting, it was engaging to my mind, but it wasn't, I didn't just have fun with it. That didn't come until toward the end. It is very, very hard to sell a nonfiction book in the United States today. I need to warn you about that. But the fact that I talked to 150 or more statisticians about their individual articles meant that when the book was published, they all rose up and protected it and helped me, wrote reviews, invited me for talks and so on. So the book was really by the community of Bayesian statisticians, I think, in the end. It turned out to be quite timely because of the movement to get Alan Turing pardoned, and he plays a big role in the book. The reviews were kind of crazy. There were 4 pages in Nature. The New York Times had a full-page review in the Sunday New York Times, and it said, if you're not thinking like a Bayesian, perhaps you should be, which immediately turned my book into a fashion statement. I mean, to be chic, you had to know something about Bayes. This was wonderful. There were journal reviews in cryptography, actuarial mathematics, engineering, mathematics, computers, the Lancet, educational measurement, fields that you didn't really know about before this. So it is possible, if a community will help, to sell a book about a serious subject like science that is still aimed at the general public. Now, from the beginning of working with Rita, my job was threefold. First, my job was to provide scientific and historical context to Rita's experiences as a woman in science. It was to confirm everything we wanted to say in the book, to confirm it, to double check it, and then to get it and note it. And then it was to ask the questions, important, pertinent questions. And to do that, I had to understand what was going on well enough to know what to ask. So today, I go, for example, whenever Rita has time, to conferences like this to see her in action, or to grant review meetings. I was going to go to Bangladesh last year until they had tumultuous national elections, and the meeting was canceled. I write draft after draft. Rita edits. We send it out to people who know about the particular subject and get their comments. Then I rewrite a new draft, and Rita edits that. Our agent sometimes weighs in. And then I write another draft. So what I'd like to say to you today is this country is in desperate need of more people in the STEM subjects. And if we're going to get more people in the STEM subjects, we have to get more women and more underrepresented minorities. And we have to get more of them into leadership positions. We're going to have to get this message across. Rita's message, your message, across to general public. That is to students and teachers, and to technology and the computer industry leaders, to legislators, international and national leaders. So I would ask you, if you have anything, if you have any stories, any insights, any data into the condition of women in science in the past, particularly in the present, in the future, please tell me about it. Rita talks about her sponge brain. Now, I'm not in Rita's league. I'm kind of a secondary sponge. But if you could think of me that way and funnel me information, we'd be very grateful. We hope that you'll help us tell the story of women in science, your story, to the general public, so they can understand why, for the good of our nation, science and technology and engineering and mathematics have to change. Thank you. I have a question. When you first approached less than an hour. That sounds like fun.
And what did you say you would read?
I started out thinking that I would write about a book about the history of bioinformatics. And Rita would be the star case, the story that would pull the reader through, because she's done it all. She started with hip boot oceanography, and now she has a bioinformatics firm. But we quickly realized that that's not the story. The story is Rita and women in science. And so we go back and forth about how we're going to tell this story. But it's clearly, it's not a biography of Rita. It's a biography of the problem.
And you don't have a working title yet?
Oh, yes. Just because you're a pawn, you don't have to lose the game.
Just because you're a pawn doesn't mean you have to lose the game.
Thank you very much. That was so enlightening. Any questions?
You want our information to pass
Oh,
out
wait,
your
we have a
cards so
question.
we can.
I was just a little bit confused by one thing that you said. I'm not sure why feminists would think that female scientists are anti-feminist in the first
They did. That was the general perception at the time. It came out of the humanities and social sciences, and they thought the hard sciences were kind of a sellout to the men. I heard this over and over again. And when they read these stories, the biographies of the women in the book are just putting them in chronological order. You realize they had to jump hoops. You know, they get rid of one band and another one would pop up.
You mentioned women who didn't get the prize who should have.
Well, Jocelyn Bell Burnell, Rosalind Franklin is obvious, C.S. Wu. What I didn't realize when I wrote the book was that, when I chose them, was that in their fields, people, I'd go to a party and it would have physicists or something, and they'd pin me to the wall and say, C.S. Wu should have had a Nobel Prize. And I'd go around where there were astronomers, and the same thing would say, Jocelyn Bell Burnell should have had the Nobel Prize. So each one had its own constituency.
There's an article that came out this year that talked about the women that should be winning Nobel Prizes in the near future. And they did some sort of survey, and it came up with sort of the top 5 or 6, and then they had a list of the often mentioned women as well. So you might find that interesting.
You've hit on something that I feel very strongly about.
Could you repeat that? Because we couldn't hear it back here. Sorry, question. So there was
I'm sorry. There's an article about future Nobel Prize winners, women. Okay. And so what did I think about that? You know, the Nobel Prize is a wonderful prize, but it's a prize. It's a contest. There are rules, regulations, and you have to meet it. And there are many, many people, men and women, doing world-class, Nobel-class research who do not get the prize. Okay? And some of them feel that they've lost out, that they're failures. Their spouses think they're failures. Okay? So don't lay that on somebody young. Don't say you're going to be a future Nobel Prize winner. I've had parents come up and say, I'm going to give this book to my daughter, and she's going to be a Nobel Prize winner. And I say, please don't. You know, don't even buy the book if that's your message.
May I ask, in your efforts to canonize Rita and make her the patron saint, try not to make her the patron saint of women only. There are a few men who wouldn't mind worshiping at her altar as well, just as an aside.
I think that Rita's probably done many, many wonderful things
Absolutely.
that you don't know about. Okay?
Across the board.
And will.
So, I want to thank you for your work, because it's really important for all of us and for this organization. I also wanted to get your comments, if you have any, on recent work that's been done by Walter Isaacson, for example. It kind of takes us back to the early discussions in this Rosalind Franklin Society group. Walter has written now very extensively about technology and about Silicon Valley, and he seems to believe that he has discovered Grace Hopper and reinstated her to someplace in people's ideas of the world and science, because he wrote a book about Silicon Valley and about technology. And it must be very frustrating, it certainly is for me, to see not only women overlooked in science and in the leadership and the development of science, but also to have popular writing that essentially does this all over again in new and inventive ways. That's my commentary. I'm actually asking you for your opinion.
Well, of course, I read something that's really good, and I wish, oh my gosh, I wish I'd done that. So part of me responds like that. But actually, I think it's wonderful if Grace Hopper has become so well-known, so popular, such an important figure that a lot of people want to write about her. I think that's great. That's our purpose. That's our goal.
We have one more question. Think we have one more question over there?
I will.
This is going to be the last question.
Okay.
We got it.
Nina?
It's just a comment. My lab was the lab that, I knew Barbara McClintock quite well, and my lab was the lab that actually brought her work into the molecular age. For Barbara, it was a pain to get the Nobel Prize. She hated all the stuff that went with it.
When I
Interesting.
first called her, well, how many minutes?
A minute.
A minute, okay. When I first called, succeeded in, well, she called me. I was typing away and I picked up the phone, and this voice like Katharine Hepburn's crackled over the phone. I can speak with Sharon McGrayne. This is Barbara McClintock. And I said, well, I'm working on this project, and I'd really like to talk to you. And she said, the Nobel Prize is a distortion of science. It's terrible. It takes up too much time. I'm too old for this. An interview exhausts me. And then after a while, she agreed to accept phone calls from me. And the first one, I went through my 3 questions and said thank you. And she said, do you have any more? So I went through 3 more. And she said, do you have any more? And the 3 more, I thanked her. And she said, are you getting tired? And after that, we were off and running. And I'm told she enjoyed them. No, that was long before I could work a tape.
You tape now, by the way.
Yeah, but I take notes.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting.